The blizzard had clawed at the small dugout for 3 days, a monstrous white beast howling its fury. Inside, huddled by the meager warmth of smoldering buffalo chips, Alara listened to the wind's shriek, each gust a fresh blow against the fragile shell of her existence. Hunger was a dull ache, cold a constant enemy seeping through the earth walls. She was alone, utterly alone, a widow left stranded on this indifferent plain, her grief a cold stone in her gut. Then, a sound reached her, cutting through the wind's roar, a faint, thin cry. Impossibly, it was a child. Pushing aside the heavy buffalo hide covering the entrance, she stepped into the maelstrom. The wind stole her breath, the snow blinded her. But the cry, impossibly, came again, closer. Driven by something primal, something beyond her own despair, she fought her way forward, stumbling through drifts that threatened to swallow her. She found it huddled against a snow-laden scrub bush, a small bundle of furs, dark hair plastered to a tiny forehead, a face blue with cold. An infant, Comanche, abandoned, lost, it didn't matter. Life, fragile and small, clung desperately to the edge of the storm. She scooped the child up, pulling it against her chest, shielding it with her own body, and fought her way back to the dugout, the cry softening to a whimper against her skin. Inside, shivering uncontrollably, she unwrapped the bundle. It was a girl, impossibly small, but alive. Alara had little to offer: warmed water, a scrap of pemmican chewed to a paste. But she offered it all. Caring for the infant became an anchor in the tempest, a task that pulled her focus from the crushing weight of her solitude and fear. The child slept mostly, stirring only to feed or let out soft, weak cries. Alara held her, rocked her, whispered wordless comforts learned from a life that felt 1,000 years away. The storm raged, but within the dugout, a tiny, fragile warmth persisted, a defiance against the overwhelming cold and desolation outside. The days blurred into a single struggle for survival, hers intertwined with the child's. The infant, nameless to her, became simply little one, a silent promise in the heart of the wilderness. When the wind finally began to subside, leaving behind an unnerving quiet and a landscape transformed into an endless, pristine white canvas under a pale sun, Alara felt a different kind of dread. The storm was gone, but the world outside remained, vast, empty, and now, with the presence of the Comanche child, infinitely more complex. Days crawled by under a sky that seemed impossibly large after the confinement of the blizzard. The snow began its slow, grudging retreat, revealing the mud-scarred, desolate earth beneath. Alara cared for the infant, the quiet routine a stark contrast to the recent fury of the storm. She rationed their meager food, searched for roots the frost hadn't claimed, always keeping a watchful eye on the horizon. The isolation was a heavy cloak, but the child's presence was a faint light against the crushing dark. The dread she felt wasn't just the fear of being alone. It was the fear of what the melting snow might uncover, what lives might have been lost, and who might come searching. Then they came. First, a smudge on the horizon, barely visible against the vast, indifferent sky. Then, forms coalesced, figures moving with a weary, relentless purpose. A large group, warriors. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird trapped in her chest. There were many of them, too many for her small dugout to hide from, too many for her to defend against. They were Comanche, their movements purposeful, their gazes scanning the land. They were emaciated, their ribs showing under stretched skin, their faces hollowed by hunger and hardship. But even in their weakened state, there was a formidable air about them, a resilience etched into their bones. They approached the dugout slowly, deliberately. Alara stood frozen in the entrance, the infant clutched tightly against her chest, her mind a frantic scramble of fear and resignation. There was nowhere to run. Flight was impossible across this open, thawing ground. Resistance was futile. She met their eyes as they drew closer, searching their faces for any sign: hostility, recognition, mercy. They stopped a short distance away, a silent, imposing line of worn men. Their leader stepped forward. He was tall, even in his gauntness, his face a mask of fatigue and stoicism. His eyes, dark and intense, fixed on her, then dropped to the bundle in her arms. A flicker of something, surprise, recognition, crossed his face, quickly masked. He spoke a few words in a language she didn't understand, his voice low and rough. The other warriors watched, silent, their exhaustion palpable, their hunger a visible presence. She could only offer silence in return, a trembling, vulnerable target. The leader's gaze returned to her face, searching. He gestured towards the child. Alara understood. This was why they were here. This was their child. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her, relief that the child might be returned to her people, fear of their reaction, and a strange, unexpected pang of loss at the thought of letting her go. The space between them hummed with tension, the vast, silent plain bearing witness to this fragile, fraught encounter between a lone white woman and a band of starving Comanche warriors. A tense quiet settled over the small encampment that formed near her dugout. The warriors, under the stoic command of the man she now knew was their leader, called Obsidian Knife, were a study in weary endurance. They moved with a quiet economy of motion, setting up temporary shelters from hides and branches, conserving every scrap of energy. Hunger was a constant, gnawing presence among them. Alara watched them from the entrance of her dugout, the infant a silent weight in her arms. The initial fear hadn't entirely dissipated, but it was tempered by observation. They hadn't attacked her. They hadn't immediately taken the child. They seemed waiting. Obsidian Knife often sat apart from the others, his gaze sweeping the horizon or fixed on the ground in quiet contemplation. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a calm, authoritative center for the group. He would look towards her dugout sometimes, his expression unreadable. The infant, who had begun to show signs of recovery under Alara's care, became a silent bridge between their worlds. She would stir, whimper, or sometimes let out a soft gurgle, sounds that drew the eyes of the warriors, particularly Obsidian Knife. There was a reverence in their gazes when they looked at the child, a stark contrast to the harshness of their current reality. Necessity began to erode the barriers. They had fire but little fuel. She had a small, dwindling supply of buffalo chips. She began to leave small bundles near their camp, a silent offering. They, in turn, left small offerings of their own, a snare they had set, a handful of edible roots they had found, a piece of fire-hardened wood. Silent exchanges, born of shared hardship and the unspoken acknowledgement of her role in saving the child. Alara found herself watching Obsidian Knife, studying his movements, his quiet strength. He seemed to possess an ancient understanding of the land, of survival against impossible odds. She, who had felt utterly broken and useless, began to see a different kind of strength, not the brute force she associated with the men in her past life, but a quiet, resilient power that endured. Caring for the infant demanded her attention, pulling her outside of her own grief and fear. The child needed feeding, warmth, comfort. This small, fragile life depended entirely on her. It was a burden, but also a purpose she hadn't had before. She spoke to the child in soft whispers, sharing stories of a world the infant would likely never know, finding a strange comfort in the sound of her own voice in the quiet expanse. She noticed Obsidian Knife watching these interactions, his dark eyes following her movements, the gentle way she held the child. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but curiosity and a tentative understanding were beginning to grow in its place. They were survivors, facing the same brutal world. And for now, the infant bound their fates in an uncertain alliance on the thawing plain. The shared, desperate need for food became the next crucible. The land, stripped bare by winter, offered little. The warriors' hunting parties returned with meager kills. Hunger tightened its grip on the camp. One day, a small herd of antelope was spotted in the distance, a vital, fleeting opportunity. The warriors prepared, a tension settling over the camp that was different from the tension of their arrival. It was the tension of grim necessity. Obsidian Knife moved among his men, giving quiet instructions. As they readied themselves, Elara felt a stirring of something unfamiliar. She knew this land, had learned its cruel rhythms. She knew where the antelope might water, where the terrain offered cover. Driven by an impulse she didn't fully understand, a desire to contribute, to solidify this fragile truce, she approached Obsidian Knife. She spoke haltingly, using gestures and the few words she knew, pointing towards a particular ridge, indicating a water source hidden from view. She described the lay of the land she had observed during her desperate wanderings before the storm. Obsidian Knife listened, his gaze sharp and assessing. He asked a few questions through rough gestures, testing her knowledge. There was a moment of silence, a weighing of trust. Then he nodded, a single, decisive movement. He altered his hunting plan, sending a small group towards the route she had suggested, while the main party circled wide. The hours that followed were agony. Elara waited, the infant sleeping fitfully in her arms, the hunger in the camp a heavy, shared silence. Finally, the hunting parties returned. They were burdened, successful. The small group Elara had directed had managed to corner and kill several antelope. A quiet wave of relief, profound and palpable, washed over the camp. As the meat was distributed raw and bloody, Obsidian Knife approached her dugout. He carried a portion of the kill, a significant amount. He placed it silently on the ground near her entrance. Their eyes met. There was no smile, no elaborate thanks, only a long, steady gaze that spoke volumes. In that moment, Elara understood. She was no longer just a white woman who had found a lost child. She was someone who had seen and been seen, someone who had contributed, someone who had earned a measure of respect in this brutal, unforgiving world. Days turned into a week. The warriors regained some of their strength, their faces losing some of the sharp edges of starvation. The infant thrived, her cries stronger, her movements more active. The time for their departure was approaching. There was a quiet sense of preparation in the camp, a turning of gazes towards the south. Elara knew this moment was inevitable, yet dreaded it. The quiet presence of the camp, the unexpected connection, had filled a void she hadn't realized was so vast. The morning they left, Obsidian Knife came to her dugout with the infant wrapped securely in a carryboard. He held the child out to her. For a moment, Elara didn't understand. Was he letting her say goodbye? He gestured towards his people, then towards her, then back to the child, speaking softly in Comanche. She didn't grasp the words, but the intent was clear in his eyes, in the way he held the infant. He was offering her a choice. The child could remain with her, for now, or go with her people. The weight of the decision was immense. The child was Comanche, belonged with her own kind. But Elara had saved her, cared for her, loved her in the quiet desperation of her dugout. She looked at the infant's face, then at the gaunt faces of the departing warriors, then at Obsidian Knife, whose gaze held a quiet expectation. With a deep, aching breath, Elara gently took the child, holding her close one last time. Then, with a strength she hadn't known she possessed, she placed the infant back in Obsidian Knife's arms. It was the right thing to do. He accepted the child with a slight inclination of his head. He did not speak, but his eyes held a depth of understanding that transcended language. He gave a quiet command, and the warriors began to move, a silent, purposeful column vanishing across the vast plain. Obsidian Knife lingered for a moment, his gaze sweeping over Elara, over her small, isolated dwelling, then over the land. He nodded once more, a gesture of respect, of farewell, perhaps even of partnership forged in hardship. Then he turned and followed his people, disappearing into the immensity of the landscape. Elara was alone again. The silence that descended was heavy, but different. It was no longer the silence of utter despair, but a silence filled with the echoes of recent presence, with the memory of a small, warm weight in her arms, with the quiet strength she had found within herself. The warriors were gone, taking with them the unexpected warmth of connection, but leaving behind something invaluable, a profound sense of her own resilience. She had faced the storm, faced starvation, faced armed warriors, and she had not only survived, but had acted with compassion, had found a way to bridge an impossible divide, had stood in her truth on this unforgiving land. She looked out at the plain, vast and empty once more. It was still a harsh world, still held dangers she couldn't imagine. But she was no longer the same woman who had huddled in the dugout, waiting to die. The fear was still a part of her, but it was no longer all of her. It was tempered by the knowledge of her own strength, her own capacity for survival and for connection. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges. But she would face it not as a victim of the land or of circumstance, but as a woman who had found her footing in the storm, who had seen the face of humanity in unexpected places, and who knew, with a quiet certainty, that she could endure. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of fire and ash, but for the first time in a long time, Alara felt a flicker of hope, a quiet determination to meet the dawn.